Winter fashion for women in the 1990s on the West Coast was a strangely beautiful contradiction, an ongoing tug-of-war between necessity and identity, warmth and rebellion, comfort and cool. It wasn't just about staying warm, it was about broadcasting who you were. Or at least who you wanted to be, in layers of denim, wool, thrifted mystery, and flannel that smelled faintly of clove cigarettes or incense. For a region known more for its sun-drenched highways and laid-back surf culture than any real snowstorm, you might think winter fashion didn't make much of a mark, but that would be missing the point entirely. The truth is, West Coast winter style in the 90s wasn't defined by weather forecasts. It was shaped by music, mood, and the magic of personal reinvention that seemed to be in the air everywhere from Venice Beach skate parks to foggy hills in San Francisco. Anyone who lived through it knows winter clothes absolutely had their moment, and not just as practical garments. They were worn like armor, like costume, like declarations, the fashion of the time, especially through the lens of the various subcultures that flourished. Grunge, goth, skater, riot girl, mall punk, and beyond gave winter wear a whole new meaning. You weren't bundling up because you were cold. You were bundling up because that hoodie, those sleeves too long sweaters, those worn-in coats, all said something. It was aesthetic expression wrapped in multiple layers of oversized silhouettes and thrift store treasures. Now let's be honest, this wasn't Chicago or Minneapolis or anywhere the snow really came down hard and fast. There were no snowplows crawling the streets of Long Beach, and you weren't waking up to frozen windshields in Santa Monica on most mornings. You weren't trudging through icy slush just to make it to a corner store, nor did you need 3 scarves just to run errands. But that didn't mean cold wasn't real. It was just West Coast cold. In cities like San Francisco, the chill crept in sideways. The fog moved like a slow, damp wave that stuck to your skin and made your bones ache in a way dry cold never could. Layers weren't just a choice. They were survival. Down south, Los Angeles had its own brand of brisk. The air was dry, the nights came quicker, and Angelinos, trained for endless summer, broke out their winter wardrobes the moment the temperature dipped below 65. It didn't matter if you were actually cold. What mattered was that it felt like winter, and that meant dressing the part. And how people dressed the part was nothing short of iconic. Flannel on top of flannel, for starters. You couldn't escape it. Massive, boxy plaid shirts were practically a uniform. They were less about warmth and more about presence. They slouched off shoulders and draped around waists, acting as both accessory and backup insulation if the wind picked up. Flannels came in every color imaginable, but the vibe remained the same. Slouchy, unbothered, and slightly disheveled. These shirts were the badge of the 90s grunge aesthetic, pulled straight from thrift store racks or inherited from older siblings, or maybe swiped from an ex-boyfriend or bandmate. There was something democratic about it. You didn't need money to look cool. You just needed a shirt that looked like it had a story. Underneath the flannel was where things got creative. Thermal long-sleeve tops, often in muted tones, sometimes featuring weird patterns or fading logos, peeked out from underneath baggy band tees or faded sweatshirts. Layering was key, not just for comfort, but for effect. Each layer added to the narrative. Maybe you were a Nirvana girl today, a No Doubt girl tomorrow, and a Jane's Addiction devotee by the weekend. Your clothes told those stories before you even opened your mouth. It wasn't about being styled, it was about being assembled, pieced together in a way that made sense only to you, and maybe your closest friends. There was an art to looking like you hadn't tried at all. The goal wasn't polish, it was personality. Outfits didn't match, they mixed. Jeans were slouchy, sometimes patched or ripped, always worn low on the hips. Leggings were layered under skirts or dresses, or under more jeans, if you were heading north. Scarves were long and often unraveling. Beanies were slouchy, and often looked like they had been through a few too many bonfire nights. Shoes ranged from combat boots with the laces undone to high-top sneakers duct-taped at the seams. The idea was never to look new. It was to look like you'd lived in your clothes, like they had traveled with you, changed with you, carried your mood and your music and your heartbreak through every damp sidewalk and rainy bus stop on the coast. Layering, in general, was more of a survival tactic than a passing fashion trend. On the West Coast in the 1990s, it wasn't just about staying warm. It was about achieving a certain effortlessly chaotic look that said, I didn't try too hard, even though you absolutely did. Women stacked clothes like armor, building outfits that were equal parts defense against the cold and expressions of individual style. It was common, almost expected, to see leggings worn underneath jeans. Not because the jeans were too thin, but because that double layer added texture, shape, and just the right amount of rebellion. Turtlenecks peeked out from under silky slip dresses, softening the silhouette and giving it a hint of librarian meets artist energy. And sweaters? Oh, there were sweaters, over more sweaters. It was a Russian nesting doll of knitwear. But these weren't sleek or stylish knits designed for runway-ready minimalism. These were chunky, scratchy, slightly smelly cable knits in earth tones and oddball color combinations. They clung to the body like comfort blankets and looked like they had been pulled from the back of someone's grandparents' closet or yanked from a chaotic Salvation Army bin on half-off Monday. And more often than not, that's exactly where they came from. Patterns clashed. Wool itched. Some of them came with elbow patches that had long since lost their stitching. That was part of the charm. The less refined, the better. A truly great sweater looked like it had a story to tell. Outerwear took that chaotic, oversized energy and dialed it up to 11. Despite the fact that most of California doesn't experience true winter in any traditional sense, 90s winter coats were no joke. They were bold, dramatic, and sometimes just plain excessive. Oversized puffer jackets ballooned out like protective cocoons, often in jewel tones or neon, making the wearer look like they just stepped off a ski lift in Aspen rather than a public bus in Burbank. Columbia fleece zip-ups were everywhere, beloved not only for their warmth, but for their easy zippability and sport-adjacent credibility. And then there were the long coats, thick corduroy trenches, sweeping wool dusters, vintage military coats with too many pockets. You could vanish into a coat like that. You could disappear from the world for a moment and just exist in a bubble of warmth and mystery. Sometimes you'd see a woman wearing a full ski jacket, zippers, vents, snow skirt and all, paired with a spaghetti-strap slip dress, a choker, and combat boots. Was she headed to a snowboarding lodge or a poetry reading? It was impossible to tell, and that was the point. These combinations weren't ironic, they were sincere. Function collided with fashion in unpredictable ways, and even if the function wasn't entirely necessary, the look absolutely was. Doc Martens, by the way, were not optional. They were essential. The chunky, clunky, steel-reinforced, toe-stubbing boots of the era, Doc Martens were the ultimate staple. Indestructible, iconic, and somehow both aggressively practical and quietly subversive. More than just footwear, they were a statement. You didn't wear Docs to be cute. You wore them to be taken seriously or to stomp around like you were in a music video shot in grayscale. They were heavy. They squeaked. They took months to break in. But once they molded to your feet, they felt like a second skin. When paired with thick socks, often mismatched, striped, or pulled up to the calf in total disregard of the weather, they became the go-to shoe for both literal and emotional storms. Whether it was raining outside or raining in your soul, Doc Martens had you covered. Hats and accessories followed the same gritty meets cozy formula. Knit beanies reigned supreme. They were usually slouchy, often pilled, and ideally looked like they hadn't been washed since the Nixon administration. Some people wore them pushed back on the head, others tugged them low over the eyebrows for that brooding, avoid eye contact look. Scarves weren't dainty additions. They were long, heavy, wrapped around the neck multiple times, sometimes dragging dramatically behind their wearers like a comfort item with fringe. Gloves were a little less common on the West Coast, but fingerless gloves had their cultural moment, especially among the creative types lurking in bookstores or loitering behind gyms, sketching in notebooks, and quoting Sylvia Plath. You could often spot them with ink-stained fingers and half-bitten nails, wrapped in mismatched wool layers like they'd time-traveled from a cooler, moodier dimension. Pockets, meanwhile, weren't just decorative. They were sacred. Pockets were where hands went when words didn't. They held lighters, lip balm, mixtapes, old receipts, and the occasional contraband candy bar. And sleeves were meant to be too long, always too long. They dangled past the fingertips, hiding chewed nails and chipped polish. They got dipped in coffee mugs and dragged through puddles, but that only made them better. A long sleeve that covered your hand halfway was like a hug you wore in public. There was also a quiet but steady undercurrent of what you might generously call mall goth, infiltrating the winter wardrobes of countless teenage girls on the West Coast during the 1990s. It wasn't loud in the way punk was loud, nor was it as esoteric as full-on goth club culture. Instead, it was more of a vibe, low-key theatrical, low-budget spooky, and entirely reliant on what you could find at the Hot Topic clearance rack or the darkest corner of your local Sears. Think velvet dusters that swished behind you as you walked, crushed satin in deep jewel tones like plum, emerald, or blood red, and an unapologetic commitment to eyeliner that could double as war paint. Chokers were non-negotiable. especially the stretchy black tattoo kind that looked like they came free in a vending machine. And anything vaguely Victorian, lace gloves, corset-style tops, or dainty silver rings with fake amethysts, was considered fair game. It was West Coast Winona Ryder and Beetlejuice, mixed with early-era Gwen Stefani from her Tragic Kingdom days, blended with a girl who might hex her ex at lunch but still make it to yearbook committee before the bell rang. You know the type. Tragically romantic, vaguely haunted, and weirdly excellent at algebra. Then, on the other side of the aesthetic coin, you had the girls who leaned into what could only be described as preppy but cozy chic. These were the kids who raided the racks at Old Navy, The Gap, and Mervyn's like it was sport. Think oversized denim overalls, slouchy and slightly distressed, worn over striped turtlenecks or long-sleeved mock necks in pastel color palettes. Puffy cropped ski vests, sometimes metallic, often questionable in terms of warmth, were layered on top like it was their second skin. The pièce de résistance? Fuzzy bucket hats that looked like they were borrowed from either a cartoon bear or a particularly fashionable toddler. And yet, somehow, miraculously, it all worked. None of it matched. The colors clashed, the textures fought for attention, and the proportions were wildly unpredictable. But that was the point. The chaos was the aesthetic. It felt thrown together, but never careless. It was intentional awkwardness, curated dorkiness, the kind of style that winked while pretending it didn't know it was cool. Of course, necessity bred creativity, especially for teens whose winter wardrobes were dictated less by money and more by ingenuity. The DIY flair that flourished during this era was often born from boredom, survival, or both. Some girls sewed old sweatpants into the inside lining of their ripped jeans to add insulation. And honestly, it worked. Others got even scrappier, repurposing found items into wearable gear. Airplane blankets became shawls or ponchos, sleeping bags were cut up into capes, and in more than one pop culture moment, seatbelts from wrecked vehicles were reimagined as makeshift belts, harnesses, or backpack straps. If it could be worn, it was fair game. And if it couldn't, you made it work anyway. This was the golden age of fashion, as Frankenstein, a patchwork of thrift, grit, and personality stitched together by teenage girls who had more style than budget and more imagination than limitations. Looking back on it now, it's valid to ask, where did all those coats come from? Especially when you rewatch 90s teen dramas or horror movies and realize that every supposedly springtime trip somehow involved enough outerwear to survive a blizzard. How did they all have so many layers? So many jackets, so many hats and scarves and fleece-lined mysteries stuffed into a single duffel bag? The real answer is probably a combination of lazy script writing, production wardrobe departments with too many options, and the cinematic version of the 90s mantra, prepare for anything. On the West Coast, that meant treating a morning marine layer like an Arctic event. One hint of fog, one breeze with a little edge to it, and suddenly it was socially acceptable. Expected even to show up in a wool trench coat, a 12-foot scarf, and fingerless gloves that made you look like you wrote manifestos in your journal between classes. No one questioned it. It was the cultural version of comfort food, layering just in case. In the end, 90s winter fashion for women on the West Coast wasn't really about insulation. It was about expression. It wasn't about staying warm in any practical sense. It was about transforming mild weather into a stage for maximal self-styling. Every extra layer, every mismatched pattern, every beat-up boot and overstuffed backpack told a story. It was the decade of dressing like an emotional onion, peeling back mood after mood, depending on the day, the playlist, or the crush of the week. Oversized silhouettes became comfort zones, torn tights and borrowed hoodies became security blankets. And those Doc Martens, they weren't just footwear. They were declarations. You stomped into the world like you meant it. So, yes, the coats were real. The layering was excessive, but intentional. The fashion may not have always made sense by meteorological standards, but the vibe was untouched, impeccable, untouchable, and absolutely unforgettable.
Joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199X, we're here just for you, for you.